Liam was a man who saw value where others saw only rust. His auto shop, located on the outskirts of Detroit, was a sanctuary for forgotten iron and steel. While most mechanics wanted the quick turnover of oil changes and brake pads, Liam thrived on the impossible resurrections of engines that had been silent for decades. His latest acquisition, however, was not a planned restoration project. It was an impulse buy from a blind police auction, held for seized assets from a defunct smuggling ring. The listing had been vague, describing the item merely as a crated industrial motor, condition unknown. The crate itself was nondescript, rotting wood bound by rusted iron bands, sitting in the corner of the impound lot like a coffin. Liam had won the lot for a mere $300, primarily because the sheer weight of the object scared off the scrap dealers who didn't want to deal with the transport logistics. He bought it for the cast iron value alone, expecting to strip it down, melt it, and move on. When the crate finally arrived at his shop, dropped onto the concrete floor with a earth-shaking thud by a forklift, the air filled with the scent of ancient cosmoline and stale oil. Liam grabbed his crowbar, prying open the wooden slats that had likely been sealed since the late 1960s. As the wood splintered away, the shape of the beast within was revealed. It was a V12 engine, but unlike any V12 Liam had ever seen in his 20 years of wrenching. It was massive, wider than a Ferrari Colombo engine and longer than a Jaguar V12. The block was cast from a dark, dense metal that didn't look like standard iron or aluminum. It was covered in a thick, tar-like substance, a heavy-duty preservative used to mothball machinery for long-term storage or ocean transport. There were no valve covers, just exposed, complex rocker arm assemblies that looked more like clockwork than automotive parts. Hey everyone! Before we start scrubbing down this mechanical monster, we have a huge goal to hit. We are incredibly close to reaching 10,000 subscribers. If you love engine teardowns and uncovering hidden history, please hit that subscribe button right now. It helps us keep finding these crazy stories. Also, a massive shout out to our super thanks supporters who make these restorations possible. Thank you. We want to know our crew. Drop a comment below telling us which country you are watching from right now. Now let's get back to the shop and see what this V12 is hiding. Liam began the arduous process of cleaning the engine. This wasn't a job for a simple rag. It required heavy degreasers, wire brushes, and hours of physical scrubbing. As he worked his way down the side of the engine block, removing decades of hardened sludge, he noticed the craftsmanship. The casting was flawless. There were no rough edges or mold lines typical of mass-produced engines. This was a hand-built unit, machined with aerospace precision. He moved to the front of the engine, where the timing chain cover would usually be. The metal here was smooth, almost polished beneath the grime. He sprayed a fresh coat of solvent and wiped it clean with a shop towel, revealing the bare metal for the first time in half a century. There, stamped deep into the steel just above the water pump housing, was a designation that made him freeze. It wasn't a brand name like Ford or Ferrari. It was a military-grade stamping, X-type, followed by a secondary line, EXP-PWR-01. Liam stared at the code. In the world of automotive history, X usually stood for experimental. He grabbed his phone and ran a quick search, but nothing came up. No engine code, no manufacturer references. He was looking at a ghost. He picked up a brass hammer and tapped the side of the cylinder bank. It rang with a clear, bell-like tone, indicating that the metal was incredibly dense and high quality, possibly a high-nickel alloy used in racing or aircraft applications. But the strangest part was yet to come. As he rotated the engine on the stand to access the oil pan, he noticed that the bolts sealing the bottom end were not standard hexagonal heads. They were a bizarre, three-pronged security bit pattern he had never encountered in civilian mechanics. This engine wasn't just built, it was sealed to keep people out. Liam realized he wasn't just scraping rust, he was trying to break into a vault. Liam knew that brute force was the enemy of preservation. A standard socket would only strip the heads of the strange, three-pronged security bolts, rendering the internal components inaccessible without destructive cutting. He stepped away from the engine stand and moved to his fabrication bench. He selected a rod of hardened tool steel and secured it into his lathe. For the next 3 hours, the shop was filled with the high-pitched whine of machining as Liam meticulously carved a negative impression of the security bolt's pattern. He was crafting a bespoke key for a lock that hadn't been turned in 50 years. It was a testament to his patience. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was an industrial archaeologist uncovering a mechanical fossil. With the custom tool finished and tempered, he returned to the V12. The first bolt fought him, the steel groaning under the torque, but with a sharp crack, the seal broke. One by one, he loosened the perimeter fasteners of the heavy cast aluminum oil pan. He supported the weight of the pan with one hand and tapped it loose with a rubber mallet. It separated with a wet suction sound. He expected a deluge of black, tarry sludge, but what dripped onto the floor was a thick, translucent amber gel. It was a high-grade cosmoline variant, a wax-based inhibitor used by the military to preserve weapon parts for indefinite storage. The engine hadn't just been parked, it had been mummified. Liam grabbed a scraper and cleared the gel from the crankshaft. What lay beneath took his breath away. The crankshaft was a work of art, machined from a single billet of high-grade steel, polished to a mirror finish that gleamed under the shop lights. But the geometry was wrong. The counterweights were enormous, far larger than necessary for a combustion engine of this displacement. He reached up to wiggle one of the connecting rods, checking for bearing clearance. They were solid, immovable, and made of a dull, gray metal that felt warmer to the touch than steel. Titanium. In the 1960s, titanium connecting rods were unheard of outside of classified aerospace projects or Formula One grids. The cost to produce 12 of these rods would have exceeded the price of a standard house at the time. He shone his inspection light up into the cylinder bores from the bottom. The pistons were positioned oddly. In a standard V12, the pistons move in pairs. When one is up, another is down. But in this engine, every visible piston skirt seemed to be locked at the exact same height, halfway up the cylinder. This was mechanically impossible for a running engine. A crankshaft simply could not facilitate that geometry unless it was a disconnected or dummy assembly. A cold realization washed over him. This wasn't an engine built to run. It was a containment vessel designed to look like an engine. The X-type designation likely referred to a transport prototype, a way to move something valuable right under the noses of customs agents or inspectors, disguised as heavy machinery. Driven by a surge of adrenaline, Liam abandoned the bottom end and moved to the top of the block. He needed to remove the cylinder heads to see what was sitting on top of those frozen pistons. He attacked the cylinder head bolts, which thankfully were standard high-tensile hex heads. They were torqued down with immense pressure. As he cracked them loose, he noticed something disturbing. There were no gaskets. The cylinder heads had been machined with such incredible precision that they were metal on metal, sealed with a microscopic layer of a silver-colored compound. This was interference-fit engineering, the kind used in nuclear reactors, not automobiles. He attached a small shop crane to the left cylinder head, as the cast iron was too heavy to lift by hand. He pumped the hydraulic handle, putting tension on the chain. The head resisted, bonded to the block. He applied heat with a propane torch to the seam, careful not to warp the metal. Finally, with a loud pop that echoed like a gunshot through the garage, the seal gave way. He hoisted the cylinder head into the air, swinging it clear of the block. He looked down into the open bank of 6 cylinders, expecting to see piston crowns or valves. Instead, he stared at a flat, solid surface. The cylinders were solid plugs. The entire bank was capped with a welded plate of steel. He wasn't looking at combustion chambers. He was looking at the lid of a hidden compartment welded directly into the engine's water jacket. The V12 was a decoy. The discovery of the false deck transformed the garage from a workshop into an excavation site. The V12 engine was not a power plant. It was a fortress built of cast iron and deceit. Liam studied the welding beads running along the perimeter of the steel plate that capped the cylinder bank. They were TIG welds, tungsten inert gas, executed with robotic consistency, a technology that was in its infancy during the era this engine was supposedly cast. This anomaly suggested that whoever modified this block had access to the most advanced industrial technology of the mid-20th century. The plate itself was clearly armor, designed to withstand intense heat and pressure, protecting whatever lay within the hollowed-out water jackets of the engine block. Liam knew he couldn't use a torch here. If the contents were flammable, pressurized, or volatile, an open flame could turn the shop into a crater. He opted for a high-speed pneumatic die grinder equipped with a diamond grit cutting wheel. He donned his heavy face shield and ear protection, then began the surgical procedure. The grinder screamed as it bit into the hardened steel weld. Sparks showered down onto the concrete floor, illuminating the dark garage in strobe light flashes. It was slow, agonizing work. He had to pause every few minutes to let the metal cool, spraying it with cutting fluid to prevent heat transfer into the chamber below. The smell of ozone and hot steel filled the air, replacing the old oil scent. It took him nearly 2 hours to traverse the perimeter of the single-cylinder bank, his arms aching from the vibration of the tool. With the final cut made, Liam wedged a flathead screwdriver into the hairline gap he had created. He hammered the handle gently. The plate didn't budge. It was likely vacuum-sealed or held by an internal interference fit. He switched to a slide hammer, drilling a small tap hole in the center of the plate, threading the tool in, and giving it a violent upward yank. There was a sharp hiss, the sound of a vacuum seal breaking, and the heavy steel plate popped free. Liam set the hot metal aside and peered into the cavity of the engine block. The internal architecture of the cylinders had been completely milled away. The entire bank was a single rectangular containment locker, lined with a thick, soft material that looked like lead-impregnated rubber, likely for radiation shielding or extreme impact protection. Nested snugly inside this lead-lined womb were 6 cylindrical canisters, each roughly the size of a liter soda bottle. They were made of a dull, matte black metal, possibly anodized aluminum, and lacked any obvious opening mechanism. They sat in custom-cut foam inserts that had surprisingly resisted the rot of time, likely due to the oxygen-deprived environment. Liam reached in with his gloved hand to retrieve the first canister. He braced himself for the weight of aluminum, but when he lifted it, his arms sagged. The canister was shockingly heavy, possessing the density of a dumbbell. It weighed at least 20 pounds. The discrepancy between size and mass was the first indicator that he was holding something chemically significant. He carried the black cylinder to his clean workbench, clearing away the wrenches and sockets. He examined the surface under a magnifying lamp. There were no seams, no lids, and no hinges. It appeared to be a solid block, but the weight suggested it was hollow and filled with something incredibly dense. He rotated the object and found a small, recessed hex screw at the base. It was the same security pattern as the oil pan bolts. Liam smiled. He still had the custom key he had machined earlier. He inserted the tool and applied torque. The screw turned smoothly, activating an internal cam mechanism. The top of the canister clicked and popped up a fraction of an inch. Carefully, holding his breath, Liam unscrewed the cap. He didn't know if he was about to unleash a biological agent or a cloud of toxic gas. He pulled the cap off. Inside, nestled in oil-soaked velvet, was a single, perfectly machined bar of silvery white metal. It wasn't gold, and it wasn't silver. It had a lustrous, almost blue-white reflection that was mesmerizing. Stamped into the face of the bar were the chemical symbol RH and the purity, 99.99%. Below that was a serial number and a stamp he recognized from history books, a stylized atom symbol often used by Cold War-era strategic reserve contractors. Liam's heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed his digital scale and placed the bar on it. It weighed exactly 1 kilogram. He quickly pulled up a commodities chart on his phone. The symbol RH stood for rhodium. It was one of the rarest and most valuable precious metals on Earth, used in everything from catalytic converters to jewelry plating. Because of its extreme rarity and difficulty to mine, the price per ounce often dwarfed that of gold. In the volatile market, a single kilogram of pure rhodium could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he had just found 1 bar. He looked back at the engine block. There were 5 more canisters in that bank alone, and he hadn't even touched the second cylinder bank yet. The scrap engine was carrying a strategic stockpile worth a fortune. Liam sat back on his rolling shop stool, his hands trembling slightly, not from the physical exertion of the grinding, but from the sheer magnitude of the realization. He systematically opened the remaining 5 canisters from the right cylinder bank. Each one contained an identical 1 kilogram bar of pure rhodium. He did the math in his head, the numbers staggering him. Rhodium was a metal so volatile and precious that its value could fluctuate wildly, but 6 kilograms represented a sum that would not only buy his shop, but the entire city block it sat on. He was staring at retirement, freedom, and a legacy, all sitting on a greasy workbench next to a half-drunk cup of cold coffee. But the engine block still held secrets. The left cylinder bank, the driver's side, remained sealed, its steel cap welded shut just like the first. Driven by a feverish need to know the full extent of the hoard, Liam returned to the V12. The adrenaline masked his fatigue. He replaced the worn cutting wheel on his die grinder with a fresh diamond grit disc and attacked the second steel plate. The process was just as grueling as the first, the high-pitched scream of the tool filling the garage for another 2 hours. Sparks danced around him, singeing his work shirt, but he didn't care. When the final cut was made and the vacuum seal popped with that familiar hiss, he peeled back the steel lid. Inside the left bank, the layout was slightly different. There were only 4 canisters here, but they were larger, accompanied by a flat, rectangular steel case secured with heavy-duty latches. He lifted one of the larger canisters first. It was lighter than the rhodium containers. He used his custom key to breach the seal. Inside, he found bars of a darker, lustrous gray metal, palladium. While not as astronomically expensive as rhodium, palladium was a critical industrial precious metal, and the bars here were larger, 2 kilograms each. For canisters, 8 kilograms of palladium. The scrap engine was effectively a diversified investment portfolio of rare earth elements. But it was the flat steel case that drew Liam's attention most. Unlike the sterile metal bars, this object felt personal. It was the only unique item in the standardized cache. He placed the case on the bench. It was stamped with a faded red ink warning. Internal use only, prototype division. The latches were rusted shut, requiring him to carefully drill out the rivets to open it without damaging the contents. He lifted the lid. The interior was dry, sealed against the elements by a rubber gasket. Inside lay a leather-bound logbook and a sheaf of blueprints printed on blue vellum paper. The papers were brittle, smelling of old library stacks. Liam unfolded the top blueprint. It detailed the X-type V12, but the schematic wasn't for a car. It was a design for a high-speed turbine pump intended for the aerospace industry. The V12 engine block he had bought was never meant to be an engine. It was a custom-cast shipping container designed by corrupt engineers within the manufacturing plant. He opened the logbook. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. The entries dated back to 1968. They detailed a systematic embezzlement scheme orchestrated by a group of foundry foremen and material scientists at a major defense contractor. The facility had been decommissioning surplus experimental alloys, and instead of recycling them, this group had been melting them down, casting them into bars, and hiding them inside the dummy engines destined for the scrapyard. They planned to buy the scrap engines back themselves at public auctions for pennies on the dollar, effectively laundering the stolen materials. The logbook listed 5 engines in total, for had been successfully recovered by the group in 1969. The 5th engine, the one sitting in Liam's shop, was marked with a frantic final entry, raid imminent. Assets seized by feds. Do not bid. Burn the manifest. Liam read the last line again. Do not bid. The original thieves had abandoned this engine because the federal government had seized the warehouse before they could retrieve it. The engine had entered the police impound system, getting lost in bureaucratic limbo for over 50 years, labeled as junk, moving from storage yard to storage yard until it landed in Liam's lap. He wasn't just holding stolen metal, he was holding the evidence of a perfect crime that had gone wrong at the very last second. The wealth was undeniable, but the logbook introduced a complication. These materials were technically stolen government property from the 1960s. Selling them on the open market without provenance would be difficult, but revealing their origin could invite the government to seize everything without compensation. Liam realized he needed a strategy, not just a pawn shop. He needed to legitimize the find. The atmosphere in the garage had shifted dramatically. The air, usually filled with the casual sounds of classic rock and the whir of impact guns, now felt heavy and charged with static. Liam locked the main bay doors, sliding the heavy steel bolts into place and engaging the deadlocks. He walked to the front office and lowered the blinds, plunging the room into a twilight gloom. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was the custodian of a fortune that could disappear as quickly as it had arrived if he made a single mistake. The euphoria of the discovery was quickly being replaced by a cold, calculating paranoia. He knew that in the eyes of the law, the line between a lucky finder and a thief was often determined by paperwork, not intent. His first priority was securing the assets. The workbenches and tool chests were not secure enough for millions of dollars in rare earth metals. Liam walked over to an old, upright air compressor in the corner of the shop. It was a vintage unit he had converted into a sandblaster years ago, but the tank was currently empty. He unscrewed the inspection hatch on the side of the tank. One by one, he wrapped the rhodium and palladium bars in shop rags soaked in oil to prevent any rattling, then lowered them into the belly of the compressor. He placed the heavy steel case containing the logbook and blueprints in last, burying the fortune under a layer of dry blasting sand. He resealed the hatch and tightened the bolts. To anyone searching the shop, it was just a dirty, functional piece of shop equipment. With the physical evidence hidden, Liam turned his attention to the legal minefield he was standing in. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop, using a secure browser to research the legal precedents for treasure trove versus abandoned property in the state of Michigan. The laws were murky. Generally, items bought at a police auction came with a clear title, meaning the buyer owned the object free of past liens. However, the legal definition of object was the problem. The receipt listed a crated industrial motor. It did not list strategic reserve precious metals. If the government realized what he had, they could argue that the metals were never sold, only the container was, effectively seizing the contents under the doctrine of sovereign immunity. He needed expert advice, but he couldn't just walk into a random law firm. He called Elias, a contact he had made years ago while restoring a vintage Jaguar for a wealthy client. Elias was a corporate attorney who specialized in asset forfeiture and complex property disputes. Liam kept the details vague over the phone, simply stating he had purchased a piece of machinery at an auction that contained unexpected internal components of significant value. Elias agreed to meet him immediately, not at a law office, but at a private diner halfway between the city and the industrial district. Liam printed copies of the auction receipt, the online listing, and a single page from the logbook, the page detailing the seizure in 1968, careful not to bring the originals. The meeting was tense. Elias studied the documents, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. He listened as Liam described the mechanism of the engine and the X-type stamp without revealing the exact nature of the metals. Elias explained the concept of bona fide purchaser for value. Since Liam had bought the item in good faith from a law enforcement agency, his claim to the title was strong. The fact that the engine had been in police custody for over 50 years worked in his favor. It established a clear chain of abandonment. The original thieves were likely dead or in prison, and the company, Apex Heavy Industries, had dissolved in the 70s. However, Elias pointed out a critical detail in the copy of the logbook page Liam had provided. The entry for the seizure was signed by a Lieutenant Miller in 1968. Next to the signature was a handwritten code, EVD disp void. Elias tapped the code with his pen. In police bureaucracy, this meant evidence disposition voided. It suggested that the engine was supposed to be destroyed or returned, but due to a clerical error or intentional misfiling, it was simply pushed into long-term storage. The system had lost track of it completely. This was the golden ticket. It meant there was no active search for the item. It wasn't on a stolen goods list. It was effectively a ghost. Elias outlined a plan. They would file a motion for declaratory judgment to confirm Liam's ownership of the contents regarding the lot purchased, essentially asking a judge to pre-approve his ownership before he sold a single ounce. It was a bold move, but it would wash the money clean. Liam left the diner feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. The path was clear, but it required him to expose the find to the court system. As he drove back to the shop, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the industrial park. He pulled up to his garage and noticed something that made his stomach drop. The motion sensor light above the side door, which he had replaced just last week, was smashed. Shattered glass glittered on the asphalt. He killed the engine of his truck and sat in silence, watching the shop. The heavy steel door looked undisturbed, but the broken light was a signal. Someone had been testing the perimeter. The engine might have been forgotten by the government, but the logbook had mentioned a buyer who was waiting for the shipment in 1968. Secrets that valuable rarely stayed buried forever, and the resurrection of the X-type engine had perhaps awakened more than just legal questions. Liam reached under the seat of his truck and pulled out a heavy tire iron. He wasn't a fighter, but he was a mechanic. He knew how to apply leverage, and he knew how to swing steel. He stepped out of the truck, closing the door quietly, leaving it unlatched to avoid the noise. He circled the building, hugging the brick wall, moving toward the smashed light. The side door was a heavy steel fire door. He tried the handle. It turned. The deadbolt hadn't been forced, it had been picked. Whoever had been here wasn't a smash-and-grab junkie looking for copper wire. They were professionals who knew how to bypass a commercial lock cylinder without leaving a scratch. He pushed the door open with the toe of his boot and waited. Silence. The shop was pitch black, save for the streetlights filtering through the high clear-story windows. He flipped the light switch, gripping the tire iron, ready to swing. The fluorescent tubes flickered to life, humming loudly. The shop appeared empty. His snap-on tool chests, worth tens of thousands of dollars, were untouched. The cash register in the front waiting area sat on the counter, clearly visible and ignored. But when Liam looked at the engine stand, he saw the sign. He had left the V12 covered with a blue tarp. The tarp was now draped slightly askew, revealing the front of the block where the X-type stamp was located. Someone had come in, verified the item, and left. He rushed to the office. The drawers of his desk were open. Papers were shuffled. They had been looking for something specific, likely the paperwork, the logbook, or the blueprints he had found inside the block. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. They hadn't taken the engine because it weighed nearly 1,000 pounds and was bolted to a stand. They had come to confirm the location and perhaps find the keys or the manifest before arranging a heavy transport extraction. Liam realized he had been naive. He assumed he was the only one who saw the potential in the scrap. But at the auction, while he was bidding, someone else must have been watching, someone who knew exactly what that crate contained but couldn't bid publicly, perhaps to avoid a paper trail. He walked over to the pile of splintered wood in the corner, the remains of the crate the engine had arrived in. He kicked through the debris. If they had followed him, they needed a way to track him. He examined the rusted metal banding that had held the crate together. Tucked under a lip of the wood, coated in grime to blend in, was a small black plastic disc. A magnetic GPS tracker. It was blinking a slow, rhythmic red light. They hadn't just followed him, they were monitoring his location in real time. The smashed light outside wasn't an entry attempt. It was likely done to give them cover, while they retrieved the tracker or verified the signal strength before the main operation. Liam knew he had a window of time, but it was closing fast. If they had confirmed the engine was here, a truck would be coming. He couldn't fight a crew, but he could outsmart them. He peeled the magnetic tracker off the wood scrap. He walked out the back door to the alleyway, where a rusted dumpster belonging to the neighboring fabrication plant sat. It was scheduled for a chaotic, early morning pickup by a massive waste management fleet that serviced the entire tri-state area. He stuck the tracker deep inside the wheel well of the dumpster. Within hours, that signal would be traveling at highway speeds toward a landfill 3 counties away, sending the pursuit team on a wild goose chase. But that was only a temporary distraction. He had to move the assets. He went back to the compressor, unbolting the hatch with frantic speed. He pulled out the oil-soaked rags containing the rhodium and palladium bars. He couldn't leave them here, and he couldn't leave the logbook. He grabbed an old, beat-up toolbox, emptied the wrenches onto the floor, and lined it with foam. He packed the bars tightly, the sheer density of the metal making the small box weigh nearly 100 pounds. He placed the logbook and blueprints in a waterproof courier bag and stuffed them into the false bottom of the toolbox. He hoisted the heavy box into the passenger seat of his truck. He took one last look at the V12 engine. It was now just an empty shell, a cast-iron husk. He decided to leave it. If he took it, it would scream, "I know what you know." By leaving it, he maintained the illusion that he was just a dumb mechanic who hadn't yet cracked the secret. Let them steal the shell. Let them cut open the empty false decks and find nothing but air. He locked the shop, this time jamming a screwdriver into the internal track of the side door to prevent it from being picked again. He jumped into his truck, the tires screeching as he peeled out of the lot, heading not home, but to the one place in the city designed to hold valuable metal that no questions were asked about. A private, high-security vault facility used by jewelry wholesalers in the Diamond District. He was done playing mechanic. He was now moving contraband. Liam arrived at the depository in the Diamond District just as the city's nightlife was waking up. The facility was an unmarked gray building with bulletproof glass and an airlock-style entry system. He had used their services once before for a client's vintage Ferrari parts, but never for anything of this magnitude. He pushed the heavy toolbox across the steel counter. The intake officer, a man who looked like he was carved from granite, didn't ask questions. He simply scanned Liam's biometrics, weighed the box, and issued a digital claim ticket. As the heavy steel door of the vault hissed shut behind the conveyor belt, swallowing the rhodium and palladium, Liam felt a physical weight lift from his chest. The millions were safe, locked behind 3 feet of concrete and steel. He didn't go home. He drove to a 24-hour truck stop diner 5 miles away from his shop, a place where he could blend in with the long-haul drivers. He ordered a black coffee and opened his laptop, connecting to his shop's security system. The connection was grainy, but the infrared cameras gave him a clear view of the garage floor. For an hour, nothing moved. The shop was a silent stage waiting for the actors. Then, at 2:14 a.m., a dark, unmarked box truck backed up to the main bay door. Liam watched the screen, his coffee going cold in his hand. 3 figures emerged from the truck. They moved with military precision, wearing matching tactical gear and balaclavas. There was no hesitation, no frantic searching. They knew exactly where the target was. One of the men used a thermal lance to silently cut the locks on the main door in under 10 seconds. They rolled the door up just enough to slide underneath. On the screen, Liam watched as they surrounded the V12 engine stand. They didn't inspect it, they just wanted to move it. They deployed a portable hydraulic gantry crane, lifting the massive iron block off the stand with practiced ease. Within 4 minutes, the engine, the empty cast-iron husk, was loaded into the back of the truck. The door was rolled down, and the truck vanished into the night. The theft confirmed Liam's suspicion. This was a retrieval operation, not a burglary. They were cleaning up a loose end from 1968. Liam sat in the diner booth, the glow of the screen illuminating his tired face. He had won the first round. The thieves would drive the engine to a secure location, likely a warehouse or a lab, and attempt to crack it open. It would take them hours to cut through the welds, only to find the empty lead-lined compartments. When they did, their focus would shift immediately to finding the man who had bought it. Liam knew he had bought himself perhaps 12 hours of confusion before the hunt turned specifically toward him. He closed the laptop and pulled out the photocopies of the logbook he had made before stashing the original. He needed to understand who had just raided his shop. He focused on the final entry again, the one marked "Raid Imminent." He traced the handwriting. There was a marginal note he had missed earlier, scribbled in a different ink. Project Archangel transferred to VD Systems. Liam searched for VD Systems on his phone. It was a dead end, a shell company from the 70s. But then he cross-referenced the address listed in the logbook for the buyer. The address, an old industrial park in Ohio, was currently the headquarters of Vanguard Dynamics, a massive, modern aerospace defense contractor. The pieces clicked into place. Vanguard Dynamics was the modern evolution of the conspiracy. They weren't just protecting a theft from the 60s, they were protecting their legacy. If it came out that the foundation of their capital or their initial R&D came from stolen government prototypes, it could destroy their defense contracts. The engine wasn't just valuable for the metal inside, it was physical proof of a corporate felony that had birthed a giant. Liam realized the leverage he held was far more dangerous than the rhodium. He wasn't just holding metal, he was holding the smoking gun of a 50-year-old crime that built a billion-dollar empire. He needed to go on the offensive, legally. Hiding wasn't an option against a corporation with those resources. He called Elias, waking the lawyer up. He didn't speak the details over the line, simply stating that the situation had escalated to a physical extraction, and that he needed to file the papers immediately, but with a specific addendum. He needed to register the discovery of the historic documents with the National Archives immediately. By making the logbook a matter of public record, he would turn the spotlight on Vanguard Dynamics. If he disappeared, the documents would raise questions. He was going to use the truth as his shield. He started the truck engine, heading towards Elias's home. The empty engine block was traveling away from him, carrying the thieves away from the real treasure, giving him the dawn to strike back with ink and paper. While Liam sat in the safety of Elias's home office, sipping bitter coffee and finalizing the legal strategy, a very different scene was unfolding 30 miles away in a sterile, white-walled industrial hangar. The retrieval team, having successfully transported the SS Dauntless V12 engine block, was confident. They had the prize. A team of technicians in clean suits approached the cast-iron beast, wielding high-temperature plasma cutters. They didn't bother with the delicate grinding Liam had employed. They sliced through the welds with ruthless efficiency, eager to access the hundreds of millions of dollars in strategic isotopes they believed were inside. As the heavy steel plate of the first cylinder bank clattered to the floor, the lead technician stepped forward, ready to verify the serial numbers. He peered into the cavity. It was empty. The foam inserts were there, but the canisters were gone. The void stared back at them, mocking their multi-million-dollar operation. The realization hit the team leader like a physical blow. The mechanic hadn't just bought the engine, he had dissected it. He had taken the payload and left them the packaging. The operation shifted instantly from retrieval to hunter-killer. They realized their error. They had assumed Liam was an amateur who would hoard the engine whole. Instead, they were dealing with someone who understood the mechanics of the machine better than they did. They pulled up the satellite data from the tracker they had placed on the crate. It showed the signal moving towards the landfill. They had been played twice. The order came down from the upper echelons of Vanguard Dynamics. The target was no longer the engine. The target was the man. They needed to intercept him before he could liquidate the assets or, worse, expose the provenance of the material. Back at the lawyer's residence, Elias was outlining a bold legal maneuver known as a Katam action. It was a provision under the False Claims Act that allowed a private citizen to sue on behalf of the government for fraud committed against the United States. By presenting the logbook, Liam wouldn't just be a guy with a bag of stolen metal. He would be a federal whistleblower exposing a 50-year-old theft of government property. This status offered him federal protection and, crucially, entitled him to a percentage of the recovered damages, which in this case was the market value of the rhodium and palladium he had already secured. It was the only way to turn the hot, stolen goods into a legal fortune. But to trigger this protection, they had to physically hand over the evidence, the logbook and the blueprints, to the Inspector General at the federal building downtown. They left Elias's house in the lawyer's nondescript sedan, leaving Liam's truck behind as a decoy. Liam clutched the waterproof bag containing the logbook against his chest. The morning traffic into the city was dense, a river of steel and exhaust. As they merged onto the highway, Liam's mechanical intuition kicked in. He was watching the mirrors, scanning the flow of cars not for makes and models, but for driving behaviors. He noticed a gray SUV 2 cars back. It wasn't driving erratically, it was driving perfectly. It changed lanes exactly when they did, maintaining a precise distance. It was the same disciplined driving style he had seen on the security camera footage of the raid. Vanguard Dynamics had found them. They likely hadn't tracked the truck. They had tracked Elias, the known associate. Liam alerted Elias, who gripped the steering wheel tighter. They were 10 miles from the federal building. The gray SUV accelerated, abandoning stealth. It pulled up alongside them, the window rolling down. Liam saw the passenger signal them to pull over, holding up a badge, a fake federal ID. They were trying to play the authority card to force a stop on the open road. Elias didn't take the bait. He floored the accelerator, the sedan's engine whining as he swerved into the HOV lane. The SUV pursued, matching their speed effortlessly. This wasn't a police stop, it was an interception. The mercenaries couldn't shoot on a crowded highway, but they could force a crash. They swerved inward, the heavy bumper of the SUV clipping the rear quarter panel of Elias's car, sending a shudder through the frame. Liam realized they wouldn't make it to the downtown exit. The SUV was too heavy, too fast, and the drivers were willing to cause a pileup to stop them. He looked ahead and saw the exit for the industrial district, his turf. It was a maze of narrow alleys, underpasses, and confusing one-way streets where a heavy SUV would struggle against a nimble sedan. He shouted directions to Elias, guiding him to swerve across 3 lanes of traffic at the last second. They mounted the exit ramp with tires screaming, the SUV fishtailing behind them in a cloud of tire smoke. The chase had moved from the open highway to the gritty, concrete labyrinth of the city's underbelly. Liam wasn't a soldier, but he knew every pothole, every shortcut, and every dead end in this district. He was bringing the fight to the ground, where he had the advantage. The industrial district was a blur of rusted corrugated metal and cracked asphalt as Elias pushed the battered sedan to its limit. Liam was navigating from the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the terrain not as a driver, but as an engineer analyzing stress points and clearances. The gray SUV was relentless, a 2-ton battering ram mere inches from their rear bumper, its grille filling the rearview mirror. They tore past abandoned textile mills and active loading docks, sending workers scattering. The mercenaries were trying to execute a pit maneuver, tapping the rear quarter panel repeatedly to spin them out, but the narrow, debris-strewn streets prevented them from gaining the necessary width to complete the hit. Liam knew the geography of this place intimately. It was the ecosystem of salvage, a place where things went to be broken down, and he intended to break the pursuit here. He directed Elias toward the old iron works sector, a maze of turn-of-the-century brick factories connected by narrow alleyways and low-hanging utility pipes. Liam spotted his target, the St. Clair Viaduct. It was a relic of the railway era, a massive steel overpass with a notoriously low clearance, supported by thick, riveted iron columns spaced tightly together. The warning sign, covered in graffiti, read clearance 6 feet 5 inches. Elias's sedan could clear it with room to spare. The lifted, tactical SUV behind them, equipped with roof racks and light bars, stood well over 7 feet. Liam gestured frantically to the gap between the columns. Elias didn't hesitate. He yanked the wheel hard to the right, aiming the car into the dark, tunnel-like passage beneath the tracks. The sedan shot through the gap, the side mirrors scraping sparks against the iron pillars. The driver of the SUV, blinded by the adrenaline of the chase and the sudden change in lighting, committed to the turn without gauging the height. The result was catastrophic. The roof of the heavy vehicle collided violently with the solid steel I-beam of the viaduct. The sound was a deafening, metallic thunderclap that echoed through the alley. The impact sheared the light bar and roof rack clean off, crumpling the A-pillars and shattering the windshield. The SUV was wedged tight, its momentum instantly arresting, the rear wheels lifting off the ground before slamming back down in a cloud of dust and steam. Liam looked back to see the vehicle immobilized, trapped by the very infrastructure they had tried to dominate. With the pursuers neutralized, Elias slowed the smoking car to a manageable speed. They merged back onto the main boulevard, the adrenaline slowly draining away, replaced by a focused, grim determination. The federal building loomed in the distance, a monolith of glass and concrete, surrounded by the invisible shield of federal jurisdiction. As they pulled up to the security barricades, the contrast was jarring. Minutes ago, they were in a lawless demolition derby. Now, they were surrounded by uniformed Department of Homeland Security officers, bollards, and surveillance cameras. Liam stepped out of the car, his legs feeling like jelly, clutching the waterproof bag containing the logbook and the blueprints. They bypassed the metal detectors under the escort of the agents Elias had called ahead. The transition into the quiet, air-conditioned lobby felt surreal. They were ushered into a secure elevator, rising to the 30th floor where the office of the Inspector General was located. The frantic energy of the street was replaced by the hushed, terrifying power of bureaucracy. In a conference room overlooking the city, Liam laid the items on the polished mahogany table. The original 1968 logbook, the blueprints of the X-type prototype, and the manifests proving the theft. Across from him sat 2 senior agents and a stenographer. As Liam opened the book to the page marked "Do Not Bid," he wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was the key witness in dismantling a half-century-old corporate conspiracy. The chase was over. The legal siege was about to begin. The agents examined the documents with clinical precision. The connection to Vanguard Dynamics was undeniable. The X-type engine wasn't just a container. The blueprints revealed it was also an early, stolen design for a nuclear thermal propulsion system, technology that Vanguard had patented years later to secure billions in defense contracts. The fraud was twofold: the theft of the raw materials, the rhodium, and the theft of intellectual property. By coming forward, Liam had handed the government the leverage to reclaim billions from a defense giant. In exchange, the Katam statute ensured his safety and his reward. The agents placed a call. Within minutes, federal marshals were dispatched to secure the vault in the Diamond District where the metals were stored. The assets were now evidence, and Liam was the protected custodian. The fallout from the investigation was swift and seismic. With the logbook and blueprints authenticated by the Inspector General, the Department of Justice launched a massive audit of Vanguard Dynamics. The evidence was irrefutable. The defense giant had built its flagship propulsion systems on stolen technology and materials embezzled from the U.S. government 50 years prior. Rather than face a public trial that would have decimated their stock price and resulted in the cancellation of current military contracts, Vanguard Dynamics agreed to a historic settlement. They paid a staggering fine to the U.S. Treasury, admitting to historical irregularities in their supply chain. For the government, it was a massive victory, reclaiming billions in intellectual property rights. For Liam, it was the payday of a lifetime. Under the Katam provisions of the False Claims Act, Liam was entitled to a relator's share, a percentage of the money the government recovered thanks to his information. Additionally, he received a finder's fee for the recovery of the strategic rhodium and palladium stockpiles, which were returned to the National Reserve. 6 months after the chase under the viaduct, Liam sat in Elias's office to sign the final papers. The total payout, after taxes and legal fees, came to $8.4 million. The mechanic who had scraped together $300 to buy a rusted crate was now a multimillionaire. Liam didn't disappear to a private island. That wasn't who he was. He returned to the industrial district, but this time, he arrived as the landlord. He purchased the entire city block where his small garage stood, saving the surrounding historic brick factories from demolition. He renovated his shop, transforming it from a greasy repair bay into a world-class restoration facility dedicated to preserving rare and forgotten automotive history. He hired a full team of master craftsmen, paying them wages that changed their lives, just as his life had been changed. The fear of the scrap pile was gone. He now had the resources to save anything he saw potential in. There was one final piece of the puzzle to return. After the investigation closed, the FBI released the physical evidence that was no longer needed. A flatbed truck arrived at Liam's new facility carrying a heavy, familiar object, the empty, cast-iron block of the V12 X-type engine. The mercenaries had abandoned it in a warehouse after realizing it was empty, and the government had no use for a hollow piece of iron. Liam directed the forklift driver to place it in the center of the shop's gleaming new showroom, right under a spotlight. He didn't restore it. He left it exactly as it was, rusted, greasy, with the cut-open inspection panels revealing the empty lead-lined cavities. He mounted it on a plinth of polished granite. To a casual observer, it looked like a piece of junk ruining the aesthetic of the pristine garage. But to Liam, it was the most beautiful thing in the building. He commissioned a small brass plaque for the stand. It didn't list the engine's technical specs or the millions of dollars in rhodium it had once held. It simply read, "The $300 gamble." Every morning, before opening the shop, Liam would walk past the silent iron giant. He would run his hand over the X-type stamp, feeling the rough texture of the metal that had almost cost him his life and then given him his freedom. It was a permanent reminder that in the world of salvage, value is not about what is on the surface. It is about looking deeper, working harder, and understanding that sometimes the rust is just a wrapper for gold. The engine that was built to deceive had ultimately revealed the truth. One man's scrap is indeed another man's fortune. Thank you so much for watching this incredible journey from the auction block to the history books. If you enjoyed this restoration of a mystery, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next find. We have some amazing projects coming up that you won't believe. See you in the next video.